Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This video is the third in the Kumazawa Banzan series. The first video was the introduction and the discussion of biographies of key individuals, and the second video discussed Kumazawa Banzan's life, or the timeline of his life. This third video will now focus on the topic of uprisings and riots. We will look at two distinct time periods. So we're going to look at pre-Edo riots and uprisings and Edo period riots and uprisings. Now for the pre-Edo, we're actually going to just focus mostly on the Sengoku period. Going through each of the time periods in detail is far beyond the scope of this video. So again, Sengoku period and then Edo period. Two key distinctions, and it's important that we make these distinctions because these two time periods produce very different types of uprisings, and the methodology of how these uprisings were handled by authorities also differs greatly. So let's start by looking at the pre-Edo uprisings. So using the Sengoku period as sort of the generic stand-in for pre-Edo examples, we have to understand that there's a distinctive relationship to power regarding the Bushi and the peasants. So let's focus on these 4 points. 1. The peasants were not beholden to a countrywide shogun. That means that the peasants answered to their local daimyo, to the local warlord, to the local samurai. There wasn't a massive country structure. There was just their province. 2. The peasants did not own the land that they farmed. In the Sengoku period, the land belongs to the warlord, and the peasants that farm it and yield crops, they have to pay a tax, and that tax on average is a 60-40 tax. That is, 40% goes to the lord, 60% goes to the peasant. The third point is that the merchant class wasn't really developed and was nowhere near as powerful as it would become during the Edo period. And fourth, social mobility was still a reality. In the Edo period really clamps down on social mobility, and that changes the nature of these uprisings. So for example, in the Sengoku period, if you're a farmer, you don't have to remain a farmer. But in the Edo period, if you're a farmer, that's your caste, that's your class. Born a farmer, die a farmer. So these 4 points are important to understand because they form sort of the backbone of the differences. Now, we need to address a key word and a long-standing misunderstanding regarding the term. So the term is iki, and I put the kanji on the screen. And this term is often translated as uprising or riot, but this is incorrect. Iki refers to a league or a group of like-minded persons who have a vested interest in a particular goal. They form an iki, a league, and they engage in some form of action in the name of their goal. Now, it's because many iki often used riots, uprisings, protests, things like that as their method of action. The idea of iki has been closely associated with uprisings, but it is important to understand that the uprising is done by the iki. The iki is the group. The origin of the iki actually is just simply that the daimyo during the Sengoku period. Now, of course, the origin of ikis, of groups of people banding together, goes before Sengoku period. But we're just focusing on Sengoku and Edo. So in the Sengoku period, the daimyo is actually usually in some sort of contract or some sort of agreement with the iki for economic and strategic purposes. So it's really better to conceive of these iki as militias during the Sengoku period. During the Sengoku period, an iki could be comprised of peasants, commoners, but they could also, and many times were, composed of kokujin. So a kokujin, they are the local samurai of an area. So during the Sengoku period, many times daimyo would clash Warlord A would defeat Warlord B. Warlord A would move into Warlord B's territory, and when this happens, the local samurai, the samurai, that is the Bushi families that live in that area, they would often form an iki and then enter into some sort of agreement or contract with a daimyo. So Warlord A beats Warlord B. Warlord B is gone. Warlord A, his territory now increases into what was Warlord B's territory, and the Sabushi who lived there are now usually form some kind of iki and enter into an agreement with the daimyo. So this is how you could get an uprising or a riot that could be performed actually by an iki of kokujin. So that would be called like a kokujin iki, or a league of local samurai doing some sort of uprising. So the iki could be commoners, but it could also be samurai. And in the Sengoku period, could be a combination of both. These uprisings and riots could also come from religious institutions as well, such as temples. Some, not all, but some Buddhist temples were pretty wealthy and powerful, and they held great sway over the peasants and even the local samurai. So, if needed, the temple could actually summon forth an iki to go into action against any warlord that they deemed a threat. So, let's recap. Pre-Edo times, focusing on the Sengoku period. We have alliances, iki, of people that band together to take an action, usually violent, against some warlord. Again, iki, think of it like a militia. You could also have an uprising or rebellion, but you can also have uprisings and rebellions from retainers who are turning against their lord, such as a general turning on the daimyo. So these militia uprisings or these retainers turning on their lord, these types of uprisings and rebellions, these are the types that are discussed in the Tada Genji tradition and in the Kusunoki tradition. These are the ikis, aka leagues, aka militias, and the sort of uprisings that take place within the Bushi military mindset, within that training system, within that teaching system. So there are teachings for causing these uprisings and teachings for avoiding these uprisings within Tada Genji, Kusunoki, Shotoku Gengaden, etc. That will be for the next video. Video 4 will look at Kusunoki teachings regarding this topic, Tada Genji teachings, etc., etc. However, because this is the Kumazawa Banzan series, and we're going to also look at the Edo period uprisings, aside from Yui Shosetsu's uprising in the Shimabara rebellion. So what we're about to look at is the Edo period rebellions, or the Edo period uprisings. But you have to remember the Shimabara and Yui Shosetsu's uprisings don't count. They're not good representations. They're outliers. They're special circumstances. So Sengoku period type uprisings, that's like Tada Genji Kusunoki. Edo period uprisings, now we're looking at what Kumazawa Banzan is going to be discussing. The uprisings and riots of the Edo period are best described as procedural suffering. They have a surprising methodology that is both organized and methodical, and yet horrific at the same time, right? But before we go into the details, we need to better understand the context. So let's dive into that. During the Edo period, the entire country is now under a single warlord. That is the military commander operating under imperial rule, aka the shogun. The entire country answers to the shogun. It's no longer a collection of individual warring states. It is one state, aka it's one country, run by the shogun. This makes a huge difference. The shogun is in charge of everything, and everything is an extension of the shogun. So even though the country is organized into domains, and each domain has a daimyo or lord of that domain, everything is, again, still an extension of the shogun. The peasants of a domain are the peasants of the shogun, not the peasants of the lord of the domain. And this changes things considerably. Remember, in the Sengoku period, the peasants are they're the peasants of the local warlord. But now all the peasants are this, I don't want to say the property of the shogun, but they are the shogun's peasants. They are not the domain lord's peasants. We also need to look at the total value of the economy of Japan is in the 1600s estimated to have been about 18.5 million koku. And by the mid 1700s, this is estimated to have risen to about 26.5 million koku. Now, for those of you not familiar, 1 koku of rice is about 5 bushels of rice, or 2.5 hyo of rice. Now, this level of economic wealth and resource obviously needs to be systematically handled, but this is too big of a venture to just be handled by the samurai. So the farmers have to get in on this. So the farmers actually play a role in the systematic handling of this much wealth. So in the Edo period, the farmers are actually given land rights and legal rights over the land and the land management. Now imagine this. This is a big change. In the Sengoku period, the warlord owns the land and it has all rights over the land. But in the Edo period, the farmers own the land. They have legal authority. They have legal say. They actually are in charge of the land that they're farming. Farming, this is a huge difference. Now, farming, part of this is because farming is related directly to the tax system. So you have a lot of land, a lot of wealth. These guys are farming it, and the only way to really turn this into a viable economic system is to have it based on a tax system. And since farming is directly related to the tax system, you're going to see why the farmers are not only related, why they're not just in charge of the farms now, but it's also related to how taxes are collected. So different domains have different ratings, and those domains are expected to produce different amounts of koku. And so basically domains become rated by the koku they produce. Which samurai lord gets assigned to which domain is a balance of the domain's value with the samurai's personal standing within the Tokugawa shogun's eyes. So basically, in a simple way, if the Tokugawa shogun thinks that values you, you can get a higher valued domain, more koku, and if you're less valuable, then your domain is less koku, less valuable. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's a general summary of how that works. Again, like I said, it's more complicated than that. But anyway, so you have different domains of different value, but they have to be managed. So a system of supervisors is put in place to oversee this system. So and the original 40-60 split was retained in the beginning of the 1600s, but by the later 1600s that becomes a 50-50 split. And taxes are broken down into different categories, such as kayaku tax, which is a tax for repairing roads, bridges, and then there's the huyaku tax, which actually goes to paying the cost of the supervisors, paying the supervisor's salary and things like that. And of course there's many other taxes. These are just two examples. Now the taxes are determined by one of two ways. They either yearly take a sample of the domain, so they mark off a particular amount of land and they figure how much koku that produces. They do some math and they come up with a yearly estimate. And so that if it goes that route, then they do an estimate every year. The other way that a tax is determined is they do a total crop calculation and then they set that rate for many years. So alright, so now that we get a general idea of the basics of like how that's done, let's look at how land ownership is a key piece in this. And again, remember, as I said, in the Sengoku period the warlord owns the land, but during the Edo period the farmers own the land. And farmers own the land, and oftentimes they employ others to actually work the fields. So when you talk about farmers in the Edo period, you have to sort of make the distinction. Are these the farmers that own the land and hire the field hands, or are you talking about the field hands? So for the purpose of this video, we're going to be discussing the farmers who own the land and hire the field hands to actually work the fields. It's a key distinction to make. So these farmers, the ones who actually own the land, they are broken into groups of 5 called gonin gumi, or group of 5 people. Gonin, 5 humans or 5 people. Gumi means group of 5 people. Now this is very similar to Bushi military methods. And basically because among the Bushi breaking into groups of 5 is a standard, when Bushi are in control of the country, when the shoguns are in control of the country, they say, okay, the farmers will be broken into groups of 5. That's just a carryover from Bushi tradition. So, groups of 5 farmers. Now, these groups of 5 are the ones basically in charge of everything that goes on their lands and farms. So you got 5 guys that own 5 farms, and that's the unit. That's the standard unit. They had the responsibility to interact with the samurai administration. They were the ones that collected the taxes. So each gonin gumi was responsible for the tax, collecting the tax of their 5 farms. And then from this you get some of these positions which become important. You have the nanushi, or aka the shoya. That's the head of the villages, appointed by supervisors, or the samurai administration of the domain. Then you have the gumingaishira, the head of these groups. Then you have the hyakushodai. It's a misspelling there. It's not hayas. It's hyakushodai, and that is an elder who sort of is over all of the farmer groups in the area. And so what you see here is not only the land ownership, but there's a power structure in play here made up of these land owning farmers. And in the beginning, officially, the shogun encouraged peace among the farmers and considered them of great importance, that farming is key to the state. The system of leaders is supposed to make sure farmers had everything that they needed. However, by the late 1640s, these policies become more draconian. Farmers are required to show more and more respect and deference to the administration than before. They are also expected to follow things such as official daily schedules. Wake up at this time, do this at this time, do this at this time. There's even efforts to try to ban farmers from being able to smoke and drink. At the same time that this is happening, the merchant class begins to see an increase in their power and influence due to the fact that money becomes more and more useful during this time period. Farmers, again, that's the head farmers, like the members of the gonin gumi. They're witnessing merchants amassing wealth and flaunting more social freedom, while the farmers are seeing their own freedom slowly be eroded. Now this of course causes some societal disharmony, but it also, rather than causing any kind of fighting between the merchants and the farmers, it causes some discontent between the farmers and the samurai administration, but it also causes farmers to begin to engage more with material culture or money culture. Now not all of them do, but many of them do. And this of course begins to create sort of disharmony among the farmers. So what do I mean by money culture? Farmers want to start amassing money. You know, they have land, they have people working for them, but now they want money. They want to buy silk. They want to pay for entertainment. So because the merchants begin to boom so much in the 1600s, the farmers are now seeing something that they want. So this only adds to the overall sort of discontent that is growing at the same time that their own rights and privileges are being repealed. So it's a two-pronged issue. And to streamline this video, and for the sake of time, because these videos are already rather long, we won't go into all the various reasons that farmers would engage in riots or uprisings in the Edo period, but suffice to say, they are often the result of working conditions eroding, corrupt official behaviors, things like that. And again, you know, new rules, new taxes, etc., 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 can cause these issues. So the typical sort of issue is working conditions or some kind of corruption among an official. That tends to be it. basically the thing to take away here is that when farmers wanted to rebel, again, merchants didn't really rebel. The merchants formed criminal organizations and they formed guilds. It's the farmers who rebelled. The farmers are the ones that riot. So when farmers rebel and riot in the Edo period, again, there is a systematic method. It's methodical and it's brutal, and we're about to get into it. So here it goes. In essence, again, to summarize, to make it simple and clear, farmers would form an iki, they would write up their grievances, they would march to the Lord, burning some buildings down along the way. The heads of the iki would meet with the Lord would hear them out, the Lord would take action to resolve their complaints. The heads of the iki are then tortured and executed, and then the local administrator is probably removed from their position. And yes, you heard me correctly. That process is exactly like I just explained. There's estimated to be around 1,200 uprisings recorded from 1600 to 1867. And while the procedure and the reason for these uprisings do change a little bit based on time and location, in essence, what I described is the fundamental protocol for an uprising or a riot within the Edo period. And of course, as I said, the Shimabara Rebellion and Yui Shosetsu's uprisings are outliers from this pattern. 99.99% of the uprisings in the Edo period are based on this model. The heads of the iki knew that they'd be tortured and killed, but their sacrifice usually produces some, if not most, of the desired changes. Corrupt and incapable administrators were often relieved of their posts due to their inability to manage the territory effectively. So that was the ultimate punishment. That was ultimately the punishment. The heads of the iki are executed for committing an uprising, but the local administrator is essentially fired or removed from their position because they were incapable of meeting the needs of the locals. It's a very interesting combination of laws producing a very efficient yet brutal procedure. And as you see at the bottom of the screen, local administrators were actually rather terrified of the idea of an iki bringing a petition to their lord, because if the iki managed to bring a petition to the lord, there was a good chance that they'd be removed from their post. However, as the 1600s progressed, things got less and less weighted to the farmers. After the Shimabara Rebellion, there became a fine line between an iki and something called a toto. And a toto is a rebellious mob, and local administrators are given more freedom to deal with a toto. So at this time, though, after the Shimabara Rebellion specifically, the toto and the handling of a toto are more directed to ronin or wicked-minded samurai. The concern was future military riots. So initially, a toto is more of a rebellious mob of military nature. At this time, there still wasn't any specific law against this hyakusho iki, or a peasant iki, or peasant leagues. Actually, if you look at the laws of the 1640s and to the 1660s, so 1640s, early 1660s, the laws actually seem to give shape. They give more shape to this method that I've described, but they actually give the peasants a little more power and protection from harassment and mistreatment by administrators. But when you get in the 1660s start in and you start to go toward the 1670s, the laws begin to change and to erode freedoms and powers of peasants pretty quickly. So the tides change real quickly at that point. So by 1682, though, the assembly of peasants under oath is formally illegal. And it's becoming, up until 1680, so, once you start getting out of the 1660s and you're going from 1660 to 1680, that's when you start to see it's going to become illegal. The things start becoming problematic, and by 1682 it is codified as law. Peasants can now cannot come together now under an oath. So basically now you're seeing where ikis are pretty much done for. And while the peasants had been suffering issues under the system and forced to use uprisings in which leaders would have to sacrifice themselves, they had roughly been staying somewhat ahead in terms of the law, still providing them a fair measure of favor. But again, starting at 1660, this begins to disappear and just continues to disappear as time marches on. Now remember, Kumazawa Banzan focused this, so this is the type of uprising that Kumazawa Banzan's focused on. So Tada Genji Kusunoki is focusing on that Sengoku period, that warring states, that's the uprising related to military campaigns. Kumazawa Banzan is focusing on this peasant uprising, on this civil uprising, if you will. And that type of uprising is the result of mismanagement of the administration and the cost of the lives of farmers in that process. Now, Banzan passed away before a lot of these laws become more and more harsh toward the farmers. So he's going to be discussing and criticizing. When we look at his work, we're going to see a discussion and criticism of the beginning of the suppression of the farmers and the suppression of their ability to sort of like bring issues forward and have these uprisings or have these riots, starting in 1600 and then going until 1682. And we could stop the video here, but we really should go ahead and spend a few more minutes just at least looking at how these laws progress until the Meiji Restoration. So for the purpose of keeping it streamlined in time, we'll just go through just a few of these laws. So 1721, the Gonin Gumi are officially banned from forming any kind of league. So what was once Iki is now officially Toto. So 1682, they cannot, peasants in general cannot meet under oath. But now 1721, Gonin Gumi are officially banned from doing any kind of Iki work, and Iki now officially becomes Toto or a mob. 1741, increased punishments related to appeals. Not only are individuals tortured and executed, but second-tier individuals are banished, and the entire village will have its taxes raised. 1744, the privilege to wear a sword is granted to any nanushi or gumigaishira who snitches on Iki or Toto, or who physically detain members of such groups. So now they've made a law that's now trying to turn them against themselves, to reward the ones who snitch out or detain those who might try something. 1797, domains can receive assistance from other domains to put down riots. And then in 1839, guns are permitted to be used on crowds. So what we see here is actually what Kumazawa predicts or predicted. The law becomes harsher and harsher because the peasants are getting more and more desperate. So as the peasants become more and more desperate, they act out more and more. So as the shogunate tightens their fingers on the peasant population more and more, the peasants rebel more and more. The number of riots and rebellions in the early 1600s is very low, but the numbers skyrocket as the laws become harsher and harsher. So as you can see, by the end of the 1700s, the riots become such an issue that domains are allowed to actually request help from other domains. See, before then, if there was any kind of riot or uprising, you had to handle it yourself. But they're getting so bad by the end of the 1700s, the laws are getting tighter, the restrictions are getting tighter, the uprisings are getting worse. And now they have to make it legal for one domain to be able to help another domain. But they continue to make tight laws, and it continues to get worse. So finally in 1830s, domains are given the authority to simply shoot into crowds. And of course, we know what comes next. The Meiji Restoration comes next. And because the Tokugawa shogunate essentially falls apart and is incapable of keeping itself together. And Kumazawa Banzan predicts this. And because this level of mismanagement and the lack of humanity can only lead to a failure of the government, and leading the government destined to be overthrown and replaced by a different government.